It didn't begin with an announcement. No royal decree, no public statement, just a quiet, almost invisible shift buried deep within the machinery of the monarchy. But insiders noticed. Whispers turned into tension, and tension into something far more dangerous. Because when the Sandringham estate manager suddenly stopped reporting to the king and started reporting directly to Catherine, it wasn't just a change, it was a warning. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, it felt like nothing. A minor adjustment, the kind that happens quietly in institutions built on centuries of rigid tradition. No headlines, no ceremonies, just a subtle rerouting of authority that on paper looked almost insignificant. But inside the palace, where every movement is measured and every decision carries weight, this was anything but routine. Those who understood the system, those who had lived within its invisible boundaries, felt it immediately. Something had shifted, and not in a way that could easily be explained. Sandringham was never just an estate. It was a symbol, a private nerve center of royal continuity, a place where decisions were made away from public scrutiny. Control over it was never handed over lightly, because control meant access to operations, to logistics, to the quiet rhythms that kept the monarchy functioning behind the scenes. And suddenly that control had been redirected, not upward, not outward, but sideways toward Catherine. That alone was enough to unsettle even the most composed figures within the institution. Senior staff didn't question it openly, not at first. They couldn't. The monarchy survives on discipline, on the careful preservation of hierarchy. But confusion spread quickly beneath the surface. Long-standing reporting lines had been broken without explanation. People who had spent years navigating the delicate structure of authority found themselves uncertain, recalibrating, watching, because when something changes this quietly, it's rarely accidental, it's intentional, strategic, and often irreversible. Then came the whispers, not loud, not public, but persistent, conversations behind closed doors, questions that no one dared to ask directly. Why Catherine? Why now? She had always been present, always respected, but never positioned at the center of operational power like this. And yet, here she was suddenly at the receiving end of reports that once flowed to what's the highest authority in the land. It didn't align with tradition, it didn't follow precedent, and that made it dangerous. What made it even more unsettling was the silence. No clarification, no guidance, no attempt to shape the narrative. The palace, so often quick to control perception, had chosen stillness, and in that stillness, speculation grew. Because silence in a system like this isn't neutral, it's deliberate. It allows uncertainty to expand, tension to build, and interpretations to spiral in every direction. And with each passing day, it became harder to dismiss the feeling that this wasn't just a procedural adjustment, it was something far more calculated. Some began to see a pattern, not a sudden rise, but a gradual one that had gone largely unnoticed. Catherine had always moved carefully, never overstepping, never drawing unnecessary attention, but perhaps that was the strategy all along. Influence doesn't always arrive with force. Sometimes it builds quietly, patiently, until the moment comes when it no longer needs to announce itself. And when that moment arrives, it doesn't ask for permission, it simply takes its place. Because beneath the calm surface of this shift was a deeper implication, one that few were willing to say out loud. If Catherine now held authority over something as significant as Sandringham's operations, then her role within the monarchy was no longer symbolic. It was structural, real, and that changes everything. It alters relationships, redefines boundaries, and introduces a new dynamic that the system may not be prepared to absorb. And perhaps that is what made it feel like a warning. Not loud, not aggressive, but unmistakable. A signal that something within the monarchy was evolving, quietly but decisively. That power, once clearly defined and tightly held, was beginning to move in unexpected ways. And once it starts moving, it rarely stops. But to understand why this quiet shift sent shockwaves through royal circles, you have to understand what Sandringham truly represents and why control over it has always meant far more than land or legacy. Sandringham is not just an estate, it is the monarchy's most private battlefield. Behind its serene countryside lies decades of secrets, power plays, and decisions that shaped the future of the crown. And for generations, control over Sandringham has never been casual, it has been fiercely guarded. So when Catherine steps into that chain of command, it raises a chilling question. What exactly has she just taken control of? To the outside world, Sandringham has always been wrapped in a sense of calm permanence, a retreat where the royal family could step away from public pressure. But that perception hides something far more complex. This is not a state-owned residence bound by public accountability. It is personal, deeply private, and therefore far more powerful than it appears. Decisions made here do not pass through the usual filters. They are shaped in silence, carried forward without scrutiny, and often felt long before they are understood. For generations, Sandringham has functioned as a quiet command center, a place where internal strategies are refined and delicate matters are resolved away from prying eyes. It is where conversations happen that never reach official records, where loyalties are tested, and where the future of the monarchy can pivot without warning. That is why its management has never been a simple administrative role. It is not about land or buildings, it is about proximity to influence, about controlling the flow of information, access, and timing. Whoever oversees Sandringham is never just managing an estate, they are standing at the intersection of power itself. And history has proven that control over such spaces is never without tension. There have always been quiet struggles tied to authority over royal estates, disagreements that never reached headlines but left lasting marks within the institution. Because when control shifts, even subtly, it challenges an unspoken order. It forces those within the system to reassess their position, their relevance, and their future. And Sandringham, more than any other place, has always been at the heart of those silent recalculations. This is what makes Catherine's new position so significant and so unsettling, because stepping into Sandringham's chain of command is not just about responsibility. It is about inheritance of influence. It means access to the private mechanisms that keep the monarchy functioning behind its public image. It means being present where decisions begin, not just where they are announced. And that changes the balance in ways that cannot easily be undone. There is also symbolism woven into this shift, something deeper than logistics or authority. Sandringham has long represented continuity, a direct line between past and present, a space where tradition is not just honoured, but preserved with almost sacred intensity. To place Catherine within its operational core is to place her within that lineage, not as an observer, but as a participant. And once someone is positioned there, they are no longer on the outside looking in, they are part of the structure itself. What makes this even more complex is how quietly it has happened. No acknowledgement, no framing, no attempt to contextualize the move. That silence amplifies its significance, because when something this important is left unexplained, it invites interpretation, and in a system built on control that is rarely accidental, it suggests confidence, or perhaps something even more deliberate, inevitability. Because Sandringham is not just a place, it is leverage. It holds the weight of history, the tension of unspoken decisions, and the quiet authority that shapes everything around it. And now, that leverage is no longer where it once was. It has shifted. And with it, so has the centre of gravity within the monarchy. And yet, this wasn't Catherine's domain, at least, not until now. Which begs the question, how did she move from the periphery of royal operations to the centre of one of its most guarded institutions? For years, Catherine played the role perfectly composed, graceful, and carefully distant from the inner mechanics of power. But beneath that calm exterior, something was shifting. Decisions were being made, alliances quietly formed, and influence was growing. Because what the world saw as patience may have actually been strategy, and what's happening now at Sandringham might not be sudden at all, it might be the result of a long, silent ascent. In the beginning, she was exactly what the institution needed her to be: steady, reliable, uncontroversial. A presence that reassured rather than disrupted. While others drew attention, Catherine mastered something far more powerful: consistency. She understood early that within a system built on scrutiny, the safest way forward was not to challenge it openly, but to move within it, quietly earning trust, while never appearing to seek control. and that restraint became her greatest advantage. But over time, something subtle began to change. It wasn't announced. It wasn't even acknowledged. Yet those closest to the inner workings of the monarchy began to notice her presence in spaces where she hadn't been before. Conversations that once excluded her now included her. Decisions that were once handed down now carried traces of her influence. Not overtly, not forcefully, but undeniably. It was as if she had begun to occupy a space that had always existed, but had never been hers until now. What made this shift so effective was how controlled it remained. Catherine never moved too quickly, never pushed too hard. Every step was measured, every interaction deliberate. She listened more than she spoke, observed more than she acted. And in doing so, she learned the rhythm of the institution, the patterns, the sensitivities, the unspoken rules that governed everything beneath the surface. By the time her influence became visible, it was already deeply rooted. Palace staff, known for their loyalty to tradition, began responding to her differently. It wasn't a formal change. There were no new titles, no official declarations, but tone shifted. Deference grew, requests carried more weight, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, authority followed. Because within systems like this, power is not always assigned, it is recognized. And once recognized, it becomes difficult to contain. Her reputation played a role in this transformation as well. Discipline, precision, emotional control. These were not just personal traits, they were strategic tools. Catherine became someone who could be relied upon, not just to represent the monarchy, but to understand it, to navigate its complexities without creating unnecessary friction. And that made her valuable in ways that went far beyond public appearances. Then came something even more significant: trust. Or perhaps something closer to dependence. Key figures within the royal structure began to lean on her judgment, to involve her in matters that required discretion and balance. And with that involvement came access, not just to information, but to influence over outcomes. Because once someone is trusted in private, their role inevitably expands beyond what is visible to the public. By the time the shift at Sandringham occurred, it didn't feel like a sudden elevation, it felt like a culmination. The result of years spent building something that few had fully understood until it was already complete. What appeared to be a single decision was, in reality, the final step in a process that had been unfolding quietly, deliberately, and without interruption. And perhaps that is what makes it so powerful and so unsettling, because it suggests that this was never accidental, never reactive. It was planned, even if only by instinct. A slow, controlled ascent that avoided resistance by never triggering it. Until now, because now, the change is undeniable. Now the structure has shifted in a way that can no longer be ignored. And once that kind of shift becomes visible, it raises a question that lingers far beyond Catherine herself. But influence alone doesn't rewrite centuries-old structures. Something had to trigger this shift. Something or someone had to allow it. There was no public moment, no official statement, just a decision, quiet, controlled, and executed without explanation. But behind palace doors, it sparked unease, because someone approved this shift. Someone allowed Catherine to step into a space traditionally reserved for the highest authority. And in doing so, they may have altered the balance of power within the monarchy forever. At first, the absence of clarity was almost more powerful than any announcement could have been. In a system where every word is measured and every move carefully framed, silence is never accidental, it is chosen. And this silence, heavy and deliberate, suggested that whatever had happened was not meant to be questioned publicly, but internally, it was impossible to ignore. Because decisions of this magnitude do not simply appear, they are approved, negotiated, and ultimately sanctioned by those who understand exactly what is at stake. That is where the unease began to deepen. The question was no longer just what had changed, but who had allowed it to change, because for Catherine to step into this role, even indirectly, required more than quiet influence. It required permission, and permission at this level does not come lightly. It moves through layers of authority, through individuals who have spent their entire lives protecting the structure of the monarchy, which means, somewhere within that structure, a decision was made to let this happen. Speculation spread quickly, though rarely in the open. Some believed it was a calculated move by senior figures, an intentional delegation designed to prepare for a future transition. Others saw it differently, not as delegation, but as empowerment. A recognition that Catherine's growing influence could no longer remain informal, that it needed to be anchored within the system itself. But if that was true, then it raised an even more unsettling possibility, that this was not just permitted, but encouraged, yet not everyone saw it as strategic. For some within the palace, the move felt like a breach, a quiet crossing of boundaries that had always been respected, even in moments of internal change. Because tradition within the monarchy is not just about ceremony, it is about order. A carefully maintained structure where roles are defined and rarely blurred. And this decision blurred them in a way that could not easily be reversed. Advisors, long accustomed to navigating clear hierarchies, found themselves in unfamiliar territory. Some adapted quickly, recognizing the shift and adjusting their approach without hesitation. Others hesitated, uncertain of how far this new dynamic extended. Because uncertainty, in a system built on precision, creates tension, and tension, if left unresolved, has a way of spreading. What made it even more complex was the possibility that this decision served more than one purpose. On the surface, it could be seen as practical, a redistribution of responsibility in an evolving institution. But beneath that surface, it carried the weight of something far more deliberate. A signal, a reposition, perhaps even a test. Because shifts like this do not just change operations, they reveal intentions. And still the silence held. No clarification, no reassurance, no attempt to guide interpretation, which only intensified the sense that this was not meant to be fully understood, at least, not yet. Because when power moves quietly, it often does so with purpose, revealing only what is necessary while concealing everything else. By now, one thing had become impossible to deny. This was not a temporary adjustment. It was a structural change, subtle but significant, that had already begun to reshape how authority flowed within the monarchy. And once that flow is redirected, even slightly, it alters everything connected to it. But the most revealing part was not the decision itself, it was what happened next. Because while the palace chose silence, the people within it could not remain still. They reacted, some cautiously, some instinctively, and some with quiet resistance. And in those reactions, something far more telling began to emerge. And while the palace remained silent, those closest to the system began to react, and their reactions revealed far more than any official statement ever could. Behind the polished walls of the palace, the reaction wasn't unity, it was fracture. Senior staff questioned it, long-serving aides resisted it, and some outright feared it. Because this wasn't just a reporting change, it was a disruption of hierarchy. And in a system built on rigid structure, even the smallest disruption can trigger something far more dangerous: instability. At first, the response was restrained, almost carefully muted. No one rushed to challenge the decision openly. That wasn't how the system worked. Loyalty had always been the foundation, and questioning authority, especially without clear direction, came with risk. But beneath that controlled exterior, something far less stable was unfolding. Conversations grew sharper, silences grew heavier, and the certainty that once defined the palace began to crack. Senior aides, many of whom had spent decades navigating the monarchy's intricate hierarchy, were among the first to feel the shift most intensely. They had built their roles on understanding exactly where authority flowed and how decisions were made. Now, that clarity was gone. The chain of command, once predictable, had been quietly rerouted. And with it came a sense of displacement, an unspoken realization that the structure they had relied on was no longer as solid as it seemed. For some, the concern was procedural. This move disrupted traditions that had remained untouched for generations. Protocols were not just guidelines, they were safeguards, designed to preserve order and prevent exactly this kind of uncertainty. And now, those safeguards felt weakened. Not broken entirely, but bent just enough to raise questions no one could comfortably answer. Because once tradition begins to shift, even slightly, it becomes difficult to define where it ends. Others reacted differently, not with concern, but with quiet resistance. It wasn't loud or obvious, There were no confrontations, no direct refusals. Instead, it showed itself in hesitation, in delayed responses, in subtle refusals to fully embrace the new dynamic, because resistance within the palace rarely takes the form of open defiance. It exists in the spaces between compliance and reluctance, and those spaces were beginning to widen. At the center of it all was a growing unease about Catherine's role. Not who she was, but what she was becoming. Influence, when it expands gradually, often goes unnoticed until it reaches a point where it can no longer be ignored. And now, for many within the system, that point had arrived. The question was no longer whether she held influence, it was how far that influence extended, and whether it had limits at all. This is where the divisions began to deepen. On one side were those who saw this shift as necessary, a sign that the monarchy was adapting, evolving, preparing for a future that demanded flexibility. On the other side were those who saw it as a dangerous precedent, a step away from the stability that had defined the institution for centuries. Neither side spoke openly, but the divide was there, shaping interactions, influencing decisions, and quietly altering the atmosphere within the palace. Caught between these perspectives were the staff who had no choice but to navigate the change. Their loyalty was unquestioned, but their certainty was gone. Every decision carried new weight, every instruction required reinterpretation, and in a place where precision had always been paramount, that uncertainty came with a cost: emotional, professional, and deeply personal. Because instability within a system like this does not announce itself dramatically. It builds slowly, almost invisibly, until it reaches a point where it begins to affect everything around it. Relationships shift, trust becomes conditional, and even the smallest actions take on new meaning. That is what made this moment so critical, not just the change itself, but the reaction to it. And yet, for all the tension within the palace, it remained contained, controlled, hidden behind the same walls that had protected countless internal conflicts before it. But outside those walls, the story was beginning to escape, and once it did, it would no longer belong to those trying to manage it. But resistance inside the palace was only one side of the story outside its walls. The narrative was spiraling into something far more unpredictable. The moment the story began to leak, the narrative exploded. Headlines questioned it, analysts dissected it, and the public divided instantly. Was this a necessary evolution of the monarchy, or something far more unsettling? Because when power shifts quietly at the top, it doesn't stay quiet for long, and what people believed about Catherine began to change in ways no one had anticipated. At first, it surfaced as a whisper in the media, an unusual detail buried within broader royal coverage. But it didn't stay buried for long. The idea that the Sandringham estate manager now answered directly to Catherine was too provocative, too symbolic to ignore. Within hours, it began to spread. Within days, it dominated conversations. And with each retelling, the story grew sharper, more dramatic, more charged with implication. News outlets quickly split into opposing narratives. Some framed it as a masterstroke, a sign of a monarchy adapting to a new era, where efficiency and trust mattered more than rigid tradition. In that version, Catherine emerged as a stabilizing force, someone capable of handling responsibility with precision and restraint. But others saw something entirely different. Not evolution, overreach, not stability, but disruption. And in that version, the move felt less like progress, and more like a quiet seizure of influence. The public followed, pulled into the tension between those two interpretations. Social platforms became battlegrounds of opinion, where every detail was examined and reinterpreted. Some admired the shift, seeing it as long overdue, a reflection of Catherine's growing importance within the royal structure. Others questioned it, unsettled by how quietly it had happened, by the absence of explanation, by the sense that something significant had been decided without public awareness. And then came the speculation, because where there is silence, there is space, and that space quickly filled with theories. Was this part of a larger plan, a preparation for future leadership, or something more strategic, more controlled, a repositioning of power that had been unfolding behind closed doors for far longer than anyone realized? The lack of clarity didn't calm the narrative, it intensified it. As the story evolved, so did Catherine's image. She was no longer seen solely as a composed and supportive figure within the monarchy. She was becoming something else, something more central, more influential, and for some, more controversial. The perception of her role was shifting in real time, shaped not by official statements, but by interpretation, speculation, and the growing sense that her influence extended far beyond what had ever been publicly acknowledged. And then, almost inevitably, a new phrase began to circulate. Quiet at first, then louder. A phrase that carried weight, implication, and just enough ambiguity to be dangerous. A palace coup, not in the dramatic, confrontational sense, but in the quiet, strategic sense. A reordering of influence that didn't need confrontation to succeed. A shift that happened so smoothly, so subtly, that by the time it was recognized, it was already complete. That idea changed everything, because it reframed the narrative entirely. This was no longer just about Sandringham, or reporting lines, or internal adjustments. It became a question of intent, of control, of whether this moment represented a natural progression or something far more deliberate. And once that question enters the public consciousness, it doesn't disappear, it lingers, it evolves, it grows. Meanwhile, the palace remained silent. No confirmation, no denial, just the same controlled absence that had defined the story from the beginning. And that silence, rather than containing the narrative, allowed it to expand beyond anything that could be easily managed, because once the public begins to interpret power, it rarely returns to simply observing it. And as the world debated what it meant, one question refused to go away. What does this mean for the future of the monarchy itself? This wasn't just about Sandringham. It was never just about Sandringham, because with control comes access. With access comes influence, and with influence comes power that extends far beyond what anyone sees. The real story isn't what Catherine has been given, it's what she can now do with it, and that's where things become truly unsettling. Because control over Sandringham is not confined to its gates or its grounds. It reaches into the very rhythm of royal life, the timing of movements, the coordination of staff, the quiet orchestration of decisions that rarely surface but always matter. By stepping into this role, Catherine is no longer observing how the system functions, she is influencing how it operates. And that distinction changes everything. It moves her from the margins of power to its inner circuitry, where even the smallest adjustment can ripple outward in ways no one can fully predict. Operational control is often underestimated, precisely because it appears so procedural. But within the monarchy, operations are not neutral. They define who is seen, who is heard, and who is prioritized. They shape access, who gets proximity, who gets information, and who is left navigating in the dark. And now, those decisions pass through a different lens. A lens shaped by Catherine's judgment, her instincts, her understanding of the institution. That alone introduces a new dynamic, one that cannot easily be measured, but can certainly be felt. Then there is the matter of people. Staffing within royal estates is not simply about roles, it is about loyalty, trust, and long-standing relationships. Those who manage these spaces often hold more than responsibility. They hold insight. They understand the subtleties, the histories, the unspoken tensions that define the monarchy behind closed doors. And with influence over staffing comes influence over that insight. It determines who remains close to the center, who moves outward, and who gains the kind of access that quietly shapes outcomes over time. This is where the shift becomes strategic, because positioning within the monarchy has always been about more than titles. It is about proximity to decision-making, and Catherine's new position places her closer than ever before, not just to the visible structure of authority, but to the invisible mechanisms that sustain it. It allows her to operate within a space where decisions begin to take form, where ideas are tested, and where the future is quietly negotiated long before it is announced. And with that positioning comes something even more significant: leverage. Not the kind that is exercised openly, but the kind that exists beneath the surface, shaping possibilities without declaring itself. The ability to influence timing, to guide discussions, to subtly redirect focus. These are not dramatic acts. They are powerful ones. Because over time, they accumulate, building a presence that cannot be easily challenged because it was never formally declared. There is also a deeper layer to this shift, one that extends into narrative itself. The monarchy survives not just on structure, but on perception, and those who operate behind the scenes often play a role in shaping that perception, deciding what is emphasized, what is softened, and what remains unseen. With her growing influence, Catherine is no longer just part of the narrative, she has the potential to shape it. Quietly, carefully, and with an understanding that visibility is not always the goal. Sometimes, control is. The long-term implications are impossible to ignore, because once authority begins to expand in this way, it rarely contracts, it settles, it integrates, it becomes part of the system, and over time, what once seemed unusual begins to feel normal. That is how structures evolve, not through sudden upheaval, but through gradual shifts that redefine expectations without ever announcing themselves. And that is what makes this moment so critical, not because of what has already changed, but because of what it allows to change next. Because power, once repositioned, does not remain static. It moves, it grows, and it inevitably begins to interact with other centers of influence within the monarchy. But power doesn't exist in isolation, and as Catherine's influence grows, so does the tension with those who once held it. Power changes people, but it also changes relationships. And within the royal family, where every role is defined and every boundary carefully maintained, this shift has created something dangerous, imbalance, because not everyone is comfortable with Catherine's rise, and not everyone is willing to stay silent about it. At first, the tension was almost invisible. A pause where there hadn't been one before. A hesitation in conversations that once flowed easily. Because within the royal family, conflict is rarely expressed directly, it lives in tone, in distance, in the quiet recalibration of relationships that have always depended on clarity. And now, that clarity was beginning to fade. Catherine's growing influence wasn't just altering structure, it was altering how people related to her and to each other. For some, her rise was accepted, even welcomed. There were those who saw her as a stabilizing force, someone capable of navigating complexity without creating chaos. To them, this shift felt inevitable, even necessary. But for others, it raised uncomfortable questions. Not about her capability, but about the precedent it set. Because in a system where hierarchy has always defined order, any shift in that hierarchy carries consequences that extend far beyond a single role. Those consequences began to reveal themselves in subtle ways. Alliances, once steady, started to shift. Conversations became more guarded. Trust, while still present, was no longer assumed. It had to be measured, reassessed, in light of the new reality taking shape. Because when one figure moves closer to the center of power, it inevitably changes the position of everyone else around them. And not everyone adjusts in the same way. There was also an emotional dimension to this shift, one that could not be easily contained. Publicly, unity remained intact. It had to. The image of cohesion is one of the monarchy's most carefully protected assets, but beneath that image, strain was building. Because behind every composed appearance were individuals grappling with uncertainty about their roles, their influence, and their place within a structure that no longer felt entirely predictable. Concerns about the future began to surface, though rarely in direct terms. If Catherine could step into this ell of authority now, what would that mean for what comes next? Where would the boundaries be drawn? Or would they continue to shift, gradually redefining the balance of power in ways that no one had fully anticipated? These were not questions that could be answered easily, but they were impossible to ignore. And then there were the unspoken conflicts, the ones that never reach the surface, but shape everything beneath it. Rivalries that are never acknowledged, but deeply felt. Respect that coexists with unease. Support that is offered, but not without reservation. These dynamics are not new within the monarchy, but moments like this intensify them, bringing them closer to the surface without ever allowing them to fully emerge. Because the truth is, the royal family does not operate in absolutes. It exists in a delicate balance, where cooperation and competition often exist side by side. And when that balance is disrupted, even slightly, it creates a ripple effect that touches every relationship within it. That is what makes this moment so significant. not just the shift itself, but the way it is reshaping the human dynamics at the heart of the institution. What makes it even more fragile is that no one is openly confronting it. There are no declarations, no visible fractures, just a growing sense that something has changed and that it cannot be easily undone. Because once relationships begin to adjust to new power structures, they rarely return to what they were before. And so, beneath the surface of public unity, something far more complex continues to unfold. A quiet negotiation of roles, of influence, of identity within a system that is being reshaped in real time. And as that negotiation continues, it raises a question that lingers, unanswered but impossible to ignore. And as these tensions continue to build beneath the surface, one final question emerges: was this the beginning of something, or the turning point no one can reverse? This is no longer about a single decision. It's about a transformation. Because when power shifts quietly, it rarely shifts back. And what's happening now may be the first visible sign of a monarchy redefining itself under Catherine's influence. The question isn't whether this changes the crown. The question is, how far will that change go? What began as a subtle adjustment has now revealed itself as something far more profound, a slow but undeniable reshaping of authority within one of the world's most rigid institutions. Because power, once repositioned, does not simply settle into place and remain contained. It expands, it adapts, it begins to influence areas that were once untouched, redefining roles that once felt permanent. And Catherine's growing authority now sits at the center of that transformation, quietly rewriting expectations that have held for generations. The long-term implications are impossible to ignore. This is not just about Sandringham or internal operations, it is about the future structure of the monarchy itself, because when one figure begins to accumulate influence across multiple layers of the system, it changes how decisions are made, how responsibilities are assigned, and ultimately, how power is perceived. What was once clearly defined becomes fluid. And once that fluidity takes hold, it becomes increasingly difficult to return to the certainty that once existed. There is also a deeper tension unfolding, a struggle between tradition and evolution. The monarchy has always relied on its ability to remain constant, to represent stability in a changing world. But stability does not mean stagnation, and moments like this force a difficult question. How much can change before the institution itself begins to feel different? Catherine's rise sits directly within that tension, embodying both continuity and transformation at the same time. And that duality is what makes this moment so significant, because if her influence continues to grow, it could lead to something far greater than a single shift in authority. It could redefine what it means to hold power within the monarchy, not through titles or formal declarations, but through access, positioning, and the quiet ability to shape outcomes behind the scenes. That kind of influence does not need to be announced, it becomes evident through its effects, through the way decisions unfold and the direction they take. At the same time, uncertainty lingers, because with every shift comes a question that cannot be easily answered: who truly holds control now? And perhaps more importantly, who will hold it next? The answers are no longer as clear as they once were, and in a system built on clarity, that uncertainty carries weight. It introduces unpredictability into a structure that has long depended on precision. There is also the lingering possibility that this moment was not just a natural evolution, but something more deliberate, something carefully guided, shaped over time, until it reached a point where it could no longer be reversed. Because the most significant transformations rarely happen all at once, they unfold gradually, almost invisibly, until the moment they become undeniable. And by then, they are no longer in question, they are reality. That is where the story now stands, not at a conclusion, but at a threshold. A point where the monarchy is no longer exactly what it was, but not yet fully what it is becoming. And within that space lies both opportunity and risk, stability and uncertainty, control and the possibility of losing it. Because once change reaches this level, it does not stop. It continues, shaping everything that follows. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all. Not double has already happened, but what it allows to happen next. Because the future of the crown is no longer just being preserved, it is being redefined. Because in the end, the most dangerous shifts aren't the ones announced to the world. They're the ones that happen quietly until it's too late to undo them. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.